Welcome back, guys, to Mr. Cursed. Today I'm sharing 8 true, scary stories from deep in the Appalachian Mountains. These are real encounters with things that live in the darkest parts of the mountains, places where even the locals won't go. But before we start, please hit that subscribe button if you want more scary stories like this. Don't forget to like the video and share it with your friends. I'd also love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment and let me know. Your support really helps me keep making these videos. All right, let's get into these terrifying mountain encounters. I'm 22 years old, and I guess you could say I'm one of those people who always thought they were smarter than everyone else. Back in college, I was an anthropology major working on my senior thesis, and I had this brilliant idea to study Appalachian folklore. Not the touristy stuff you see in gift shops, but the real stories that families pass down through generations. My professor, Dr. Martinez, warned me that rural people don't trust outsiders asking questions about their beliefs, but honestly, I thought I could handle it. I was wrong about a lot of things. I chose the Blackwater Falls area in West Virginia for my 2-week research project. The place has this reputation for strange stories. Locals talk about something they call the hollow ones that supposedly live behind waterfalls. According to the legends, these things look human, but are empty inside, and they steal people's essence, leaving behind just shells. I figured it was probably a metaphor for depression or some kind of mental illness that ran in mountain families. Perfect thesis material, you know? I was going to be the smart college kid who explained away the supernatural with psychology and sociology. I rented this little cabin about a mile from the main falls. The place was basic but clean, with decent cell service and Wi-Fi, which was all I needed for my research. The first week went better than I expected. The older residents were actually pretty willing to share stories once they realized I wasn't there to make fun of them or write some condescending article about backwards mountain folk. They told fascinating tales about family members who'd gone missing near the falls, only to return days later acting completely different. The stories all had this same pattern. Someone would disappear behind the waterfall, usually after following strange lights or sounds. They'd be found 3 or 4 days late, or physically unharmed, but emotionally flat. Families would say things like, "He came back, but it wasn't really him anymore," or "She looked the same, but something vital was just gone." These people would continue their lives normally, but they'd lost their spark, their personality, their ability to feel joy or sadness or love the way they used to. I interviewed this woman named Betty, whose husband had vanished behind the falls for 3 days back in 1987. When he returned, she said he was like a robot going through the motions of being human. He still worked, still came home for dinner, still slept in their bed, but he never laughed at her jokes anymore, never got angry when things went wrong, never cried at funerals or smiled at weddings. When I asked her to describe what he said about those missing days, she got this haunted look and told me he called it peaceful emptiness. No pain, no worry, no feelings at all. That's when I started thinking maybe there was a real psychological phenomenon happening here. Something about the environment behind the falls was affecting people's brain chemistry or personality. I decided to investigate the water source for possible chemical explanations, maybe natural lithium deposits or some kind of mineral that could alter mood and behavior. But first, I noticed something weird about the light around the waterfalls. While I was taking photographs for my thesis, I kept noticing that sunbeams would curve around rocks instead of traveling straight. Shadows pointed in the wrong directions, completely ignoring where the sun actually was in the sky. When I used my camera flash, it would create these multiple exposures of the same subject, like the light was bouncing around in impossible ways. One afternoon, I saw a full rainbow appear in the waterfall mist even though it was completely cloudy. The strangest thing was what happened too. Oh, my flashlight. The beam would spiral instead of shining straight, twisting through the air like it was made of something thicker than light should be. I even saw stars visible during the daytime behind the waterfall spray, which should have been physically impossible. Light seemed to pool in certain areas like thick liquid, collecting in spots where it had no business being. I tried to rationalize it as atmospheric moisture causing optical illusions, But the locals I talked to would get uncomfortable when I mentioned these light distortions. They'd change the subject or find excuses to leave. That should have been my first real warning. I found historical records at the local library that backed up the missing persons stories. People had been disappearing near the falls regularly for over a century, but they almost always returned. The problem was, their families consistently reported that the returnees seemed like different people, emotionally absent, mechanical, going through the motions of living without actually experiencing life. I managed to track down Betty's husband, Frank, who was still alive and living in the same house. When I interviewed him, he was perfectly coherent and helpful. But talking to him was like talking to a computer program to simulate human conversation. He answered all my questions about his experience behind the falls, but there was no emotion behind his words. No fear, no curiosity about why I was asking, no concern about reliving what should have been a traumatic experience. He described those 3 missing days as the most peaceful time of his life. No stress, no pain, no complicated emotions to deal with. Just calm, empty existence. The scary part was, he still seemed to prefer that state. When I asked if he ever missed feeling things strongly, he looked at me like I'd asked if he missed having the flu. That's when I realized I was dealing with something that went way beyond folklore or psychology. I decided to explore behind the waterfall myself, armed with my camera, notebook, and what I thought was healthy scientific skepticism. The cave system back there was more extensive than I'd expected, with strange acoustics that made every sound echo wrong. When I called out, my voice came back deeper and emotionless, like it was being filtered through something that didn't understand human emotion. Following the caves deeper, I discovered this underground chamber with a pool of water in the center. The water looked normal enough, but when I knelt down to test it for my chemical analysis theory, I realized it didn't reflect my image. The surface acted like a mirror, but showed nothing where my face should have been. That's when I saw them. Pale figures were moving in the water, human-shaped but transparent, like they were made of the same strange light I'd been seeing around the falls. They weren't swimming exactly, more like floating in formation, and they all had their faces turned up toward where I was kneeling. These were the hollow ones from the folklore, and they weren't metaphors for anything. They were real beings living in some kind of dimensional space that overlapped with our world. I sat there for what felt like hours, watching them move through the water, and gradually I started to understand what they were. They existed in the gap between physical reality and emotional reality, feeding on human feelings and leaving people emotionally empty. The missing persons hadn't been killed or kidnapped, they'd been partially consumed. The hollow ones began emerging from the pool, reaching toward me with movements that were almost human but not quite right. As they got closer, I could feel something being drained from my mind. My happiness about finishing my thesis, my fear of failing college, my love for my family, my excitement about the future, all of it was being pulled away like water down a drain. And the weirdest part was, I didn't want to run. The emptiness was peaceful. No stress about deadlines or grades or what I was going to do after graduation. No anxiety about money or relationships or whether I was making the right choices. Just calm, simple existence, without the constant noise of human emotion cluttering up my thoughts. I understood why people returned but seemed different. They chose to stay partially consumed because feeling nothing was easier than feeling everything. I don't remember deciding to leave the cave, but I must have, because I woke up in my cabin the next morning with my notebook full of research that no longer seemed important. I changed my thesis topic to geology instead of folklore, something nice and objective with rocks and minerals instead of messy human stories. When I got back to school, my professor noted that my work was technically perfect, but lacked the passion that had made my previous writing stand out. I graduated with honors and got a good job with an environmental consulting firm. I'm efficient, reliable, and completely professional. My coworkers think I'm a little cold, but they respect my work. I don't date much. Relationships require too much emotional investment, and I find that exhausting now. Every semester break, I drive back to Blackwater Falls. Not to do research or prove anything to anyone. I just sit by the water for a few hours and let the hollow ones maintain what they started, keep me just empty enough to function in the world without being overwhelmed by it. I still don't know if what happened to me was supernatural or psychological or some combination of both, but I know I'm different now, and I know I chose to be this way. Most days I think I made the right choice. Feeling nothing is better than feeling too much. Looking back now, I realize my thesis was wrong from the beginning. I wasn't there to study folklore or debunk supernatural beliefs. I was there to join them. I'm 52 years old, and I've spent the last 20 years trying to forget where I came from. I work in insurance now, live in a nice suburb outside Charlotte, got a decent house and a steady routine. But 3 weeks ago, I had to go back to Whiskey Creek after my mother died. I hadn't been home in 2 decades, and honestly, I never planned on going back. The mountains of eastern Kentucky held nothing for me except bad memories and the kind of poverty I'd worked my whole adult life to escape. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Heart attack, the neighbor said. She'd been dead for 2 days before anyone found her. I felt guilty about that. Not devastated, just guilty. We hadn't talked much in the past few years. I'd send a Christmas card, call on her birthday if I remembered, but that was about it. The lawyer said I had 10 days to settle the estate and clean out the house before it went into probate. 10 days to deal with a lifetime of stuff I'd been running from since I was 18. Whiskey Creek looked smaller than I remembered, if that was even possible. The same narrow mountain roads, the same rusted mailboxes, the same feeling that the whole place was slowly dying. Mom's house sat at the end of a gravel drive, surrounded by overgrown rhododendrons and the skeleton of what used to be her vegetable garden. Walking through that front door felt like stepping back in time. Everything was exactly how I remembered. The same floral wallpaper, the same threadbare carpet, the same musty smell of old wood and loneliness. I figured I'd stay at the house while I sorted through everything. It wasn't comfortable, but it was free, and I wanted to get this over with as quickly as possible. The first day was just overwhelming. Mom had kept everything, old newspapers, empty mason jars, clothes from decades ago. Every room was packed with the debris of a life lived too long in the same place. But it was the neighbors that started to weird me out. Mrs. Patterson from across the road came by with a casserole on my second day there. Sweet old lady, I remembered her from when I was a kid. But when she handed me the dish, she said, "It's so good to see you're feeling better, James. You looked peaked last week when you helped me move those flower pots." I stared at her. "Ma'am, I just got here yesterday. I haven't been back here in 20 years. She looked confused for a second, then laughed. "Oh, you're such a kidder. Same old James." And she walked away like nothing had happened. I figured she was getting old, mixing me up with someone else. But then it happened again. At the grocery store, the clerk thanked me for helping him load supplies the previous weekend. At the gas station, the attendant asked how my mother was feeling after that bad spell she'd had. Every single person I ran into seemed to think they'd seen me around town recently. That's when I started noticing something else was wrong. Looking through Mom's old photo albums that third night, the colors seemed off. The grass in the pictures looked red instead of green. The sky appeared orange where it should have been blue. I thought maybe the photos had faded weird, or the lighting in the house was playing tricks on me. But when I looked in the bathroom mirror, my own reflection showed different colored eyes, brown instead of blue. And my hair looked almost black instead of the graying brown it actually was. I convinced myself it was stress. Grief does strange things to people, right? But the color thing kept getting worse. Walking through town, red stop signs looked blue to me. The yellow school bus parked at the elementary school appeared purple. I went to the eye doctor in town, thinking maybe I'd developed some kind of condition. The doctor, Dr. Chen, who'd moved to Whiskey Creek about 10 years ago, ran every test he could think of. My vision was perfect. 20/20, no color blindness, no problems at all. But people's skin tones kept shifting. I'd be talking to someone, and their face would change from normal to this sickly green color, then back to normal. The whole world looked like someone had adjusted the color settings on a TV, but only I could see it. By the fourth day, I was getting seriously freaked out. More neighbors kept greeting me like we'd been hanging out regularly. Tom Henderson from down the road slapped me on the back and said, "Thanks again for helping me fix that fence last Tuesday, James. Couldn't have done it without you." But I'd been 500 miles away last Tuesday, sitting in my office in Charlotte, dealing with a claim dispute. That evening I found something that made my blood run cold. Going through Mom's desk, I discovered a bank receipt in my jacket pocket, my jacket, that I'd been wearing all day. It was dated from the previous week, showing a withdrawal from my mother's account. The signature looked exactly like mine, but I'd never written it. The handwriting was perfect, down to the way I loop my G's and cross my T's. I drove to the bank the next morning and asked to see the security footage. The teller, a woman about my age named Linda, pulled it up on her computer. There I was, clear as day, making the withdrawal. Same clothes I owned, same mannerisms, same everything. But it wasn't me. I'd been at work that day, had the timesheets to prove it. "That's impossible," I told Linda. "I wasn't here last week. I haven't been here in 20 years. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "James, you've been coming in every month for the past 2 years. You always make small talk about your mother's medication costs." My mother's medication costs? I didn't even know what medications she was taking. That night I tore through Mom's bedroom looking for answers. In her nightstand I found a journal she'd been keeping. The entries from the past 2 years were filled with stories about me. Me visiting, me helping with yard work, me fixing the leaky faucet in the kitchen, me taking her to doctor's appointments. Conversations we'd supposedly had about my job, my life, my plans for the future. But none of it had happened. I hadn't called, hadn't visited, hadn't helped with anything. I'd basically abandoned her after Dad died 5 years ago, too wrapped up in my own life to deal with the guilt and the memories. According to the journal, I'd been the perfect son, attentive, caring, always there when she needed me. The James in those pages was everything I should have been, but wasn't. I drove to the town library the next day, desperate for some kind of explanation. The librarian, Mrs. Foster, had been there since I was a kid. When I asked her about local legends or folklore, she got this knowing look in her eyes. "You're asking about the other self, aren't you?" she said quietly. She pulled out an old book of mountain folklore and showed me a chapter about doppelgangers. According to the stories, everyone has a double living somewhere in parallel. Sometimes, when someone abandons their true path in life, the double crosses over to take their place. It starts small. The double lives the life you should have lived, makes the choices you should have made, becomes the person you should have been. The mountain folk always said it happens when someone turns their back on family, Mrs. Foster explained. The other self steps in to fill the empty space left behind. I thought about Mom, alone in that house for years while I built my new life in Charlotte. I thought about all the phone calls I didn't return, all the holidays I skipped, all the times I chose my career over family. That evening I found photo albums I'd never seen before hidden in Mom's closet. Pictures of me at community events, church gatherings, birthday parties, all from the past 2 years. There I was at the Newell Whiskey Creek Harvest Festival, arm around my mother, both of us smiling. There I was helping rebuild the church steps after the flood. There I was at Cousin Martha's wedding, dancing, with Mom like I'd never seen her dance in real life. In every single photo, I looked happy. Really, genuinely happy in a way I hadn't felt in years. The other James had been living the life I'd thrown away. I knew I had to confront him. Something told me to go to the town square at sunset. Don't ask me why, but I just knew that's where I'd find him. I drove there and parked across from the old courthouse, waiting. At exactly 6:47 p.m., I saw myself walking down Main Street. He looked exactly like me, but the colors around him appeared normal through my messed-up vision. His clothes were the same brands I wore. His posture was identical to mine. Even his walk was perfectly mimicked. But there was something different about his face, a contentment I'd never seen in my own mirror. I got out of my car and approached him. He wasn't surprised to see me. I wondered when you'd finally come home, he said in my voice. What are you? I asked. I'm who you refused to be, he said simply. When you left this place, when you decided your mother wasn't worth your time, when you chose money and status over family, I became everything you abandoned. We stood there in the fading light, two identical men facing each other in an empty town square. She loved you anyway, he continued. Even after years of silence, years of neglect, she still hoped you'd come back. So I came back for you. I visited her, cared for her, made her last years happy instead of lonely. I felt something breaking inside my chest. She died happy because of you. And heartbroken because of you, he said. She never stopped hoping the real James would walk through that door. The thing was, looking at him, I could see he was the better version of me. Everything I should have been if I hadn't been so selfish, so focused on running away from where I came from. He'd lived with purpose while I'd just lived for myself. I could take your place permanently, he offered. You disappear. I keep the life here. Your mother's neighbors, the people who knew you as a child, they'd never know the difference. They already think I'm you anyway. I looked around at Whiskey Creek, at the mountains that had felt like a prison when I was 18 but now felt like something I'd lost. I thought about my sterile suburban life, my job that meant nothing, the relationships I'd never let get too deep because I was always ready to run. What happens to me? I asked. You become the story people tell about the other self, a cautionary tale about what happens when someone abandons their true path. The crazy thing is, I said yes. Standing there as the sun set behind the mountains, I agreed to fade away and let him keep the life I'd never deserved anyway. As soon as I spoke the words, my vision cleared. The colors returned to normal for the first time in a week. But I could feel myself becoming less solid, less real. The last thing I remember clearly was watching him walk away down Main Street, heading back to Mom's house to continue the life he'd built from my neglect. I don't know how I'm telling you this story now. Maybe some part of me is still here, still trying to warn people about the choices they make. Or maybe I'm just the echo of a man who realized too late that home isn't something you escape from. It's something you carry with you. And when you abandon it, something else will always step in to fill that empty space. The funny thing is, I'm not angry about it. He was the better James. He deserved the life more than I did. If you've got family you've been avoiding, people you've been too busy or too proud to call, don't wait. Don't be like me. Because somewhere out there, your other self might be waiting to step in and live the life you're throwing away. And they'll probably do a better job of it than you ever did. I was 17 when I took my first job as a junior counselor at Camp Wildwood, up in the North Georgia mountains near Blood Mountain. I'm 23 now, working as a third-grade teacher in Atlanta. But I still think about that day every time I see kids on a field trip. Emma Chen was the other junior counselor. She was 16, a year younger than me, but way more responsible than I was back then. We were both nervous as hell because it was our first time leading a group without any adult supervision. The camp director, Mrs. Patterson, had given us 12 kids between ages 8 and 12 for a day hike. Just take them up to the summit lookout, she'd said. Easy trail, lots of families use it, you'll be fine. Looking back now, I wonder if she knew something we didn't. The morning started perfect. We loaded the kids onto the camp van at 9 a.m., all 12 of them chattering and excited, wearing their matching camp t-shirts and carrying little day packs with sandwiches and juice boxes. The trail was busy when we started hiking, which made me feel better about the whole thing. There were families everywhere, parents with toddlers, older couples with walking sticks, teenagers with their phones out taking pictures. Normal stuff. The kids were being good, staying in line, asking questions about the trees and rocks. Emma had this guidebook about local plants, and she was pointing out different wildflowers to keep them interested. We reached the summit around noon, right on schedule. The lookout point has this wooden platform where you can see for miles across the mountains. It was beautiful. One of those clear summer days where you can see the ridge lines stretching on forever. The kids spread out their little blankets and started eating their sandwiches, and Emma and I sat on a bench nearby, finally relaxing a bit. "See," Emma said, checking her watch. "This is easy. We'll have them back at camp by 3:00. I remember laughing and agreeing with her. That was probably the last normal moment either of us had that day. It was while the kids were eating that I first noticed something was off. Just a few minutes earlier, there had been maybe 30 other people on the summit. Families taking photos, kids running around, the usual crowd you'd expect on a Saturday afternoon. But suddenly, I couldn't see any of them. Not one person besides our group. I stood up and walked to the edge of the platform, looking down the trail we'd just climbed. Nothing. No voices echoing up from below. No movement on the switchbacks. It was like everyone had just vanished. "Emma," I said, trying to keep my voice casual so the kids wouldn't pick up on my worry. "Where did everybody go?" She looked around and I saw her face change as she realized what I was seeing. "They were just here," she whispered. "There was that family with the baby right over there, and those teenagers were taking pictures by the sign." She pointed at the empty spots where people had been literally minutes before. I pulled out my phone to call the camp, thinking maybe there was some kind of emergency evacuation we hadn't heard about. No signal. Not even one bar. Emma tried hers too. Nothing. We walked all around the platform, holding our phones up, but couldn't get any reception anywhere. "Mr. Jake?" One of the kids, a little girl named Lily, was looking around with this confused expression. "Where did everyone go? There was a lady here with a dog just a minute ago." The other kids started noticing too, asking questions, looking around nervously. Emma and I exchanged looks. We had no idea what to tell them, because we had no idea what was happening ourselves. That's when the temperature dropped. I mean dropped hard, maybe 20 degrees in the span of a few seconds. One moment we were warm in our t-shirts, the next we were all shivering. The kids started complaining they were cold, asking for their jackets from their packs. But the weird thing was, there wasn't any wind. No clouds had moved in. The sun was still shining bright, but somehow it wasn't giving off any warmth anymore. "We should head back," Emma said quietly, and I nodded. Something was definitely wrong, and I just wanted to get these kids back to safety. But as soon as we started packing up, the sounds started. Not silence, the opposite of silence. Every little noise became incredibly loud. When one of the kids zipped up his backpack, it sounded like thunder rolling across the mountains. A kid whispered something to her friend, and it boomed like she was shouting through a megaphone. Our footsteps on the wooden platform sounded like gunshots. The kids were getting scared now, covering their ears and looking around with wide eyes. "Why is everything so loud?" one boy asked, and his voice echoed back from the mountains all wrong, like the echo was saying different words than what came out of his mouth. Emma pulled out her compass to make sure we were heading the right direction down the trail. I watched her face go pale as she stared at it. The needle was spinning wildly, pointing north, then south, then east, never settling on any direction. She shook it and tried again. Same thing. "Jake," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but somehow still booming across the summit. "Look at your watch." I checked my phone. 12:47 p.m. I waited a few seconds and checked again. Still 12:47. The seconds weren't moving. Time had stopped. That's when the animals started acting up. A squirrel ran straight at us from the tree line, chattering aggressively, and one of the kids screamed as it jumped right at her face before veering off at the last second. Birds started dive-bombing our group. Not just one or two, but dozens of them, swooping down like they were attacking us. The kids huddled together, some of them crying now. "We need to go," I said to Emma. "Right now." As we got the kids into a line and started down the trail, I heard Emma gasp behind me. I turned around and followed her gaze toward the distant tree line. Something was moving between the trees, something way too big to be a person. It was dark and massive, maybe 12 feet tall, moving through the forest parallel to our trail. "What is that?" Emma whispered. I didn't answer because I didn't know, but whatever it was following us. The hike down should have taken maybe an hour, but with the kids scared and clinging to us, and with that thing tracking us through the trees, it felt like forever. We could hear it moving, branches breaking, heavy footsteps that made the ground vibrate. But every time I tried to get a clear look at it, it would duck behind cover. The kids kept asking what was making the noise, and I kept telling them it was probably just a deer. But my voice was shaking, and I'm sure they could tell I was lying. Emma was trying to keep them distracted with songs and games, but her hands were trembling as she held the youngest one's hands. About halfway down the mountain, we stopped for a water break. The kids were exhausted and scared, and some of the little ones were crying. That's when I saw it clearly for the first time. It stepped out from behind a massive oak tree about 50 yards away. It was covered in dark brown fur, walking upright like a person but built all wrong. Too tall, arms too long, shoulders too broad. But the worst part was its eyes. They were intelligent, human-like. It wasn't some mindless animal. It was watching us, studying us, particularly focused on the children. I felt Emma grip my arm. "Oh my God," she breathed. But then something strange happened. The creature, whatever it was, suddenly turned its head toward the forest behind us. Its whole posture changed, becoming alert, protective almost. That's when I heard them. Other sounds coming from multiple directions. Howls, but not like any animal I'd ever heard. High-pitched, almost like human voices, but wrong somehow. The big creature answered with its own call, a deep, rumbling roar that I felt in my chest. Then it did something that still gives me chills to think about. It moved between us and the sounds, like it was protecting us. "Stay close to me," I told the kids. "Hold hands and don't let go." As we continued down the trail, more sounds erupted from the forest around us. Whatever was making those howls was getting closer, and there were definitely multiple sources. The big creature kept pace with us, always staying between our group and the threatening sounds. Then I saw one of them. It was small, about the size of a 10-year-old kid, but it moved wrong on all fours like an animal. Gray skin, long black claws, and when it looked up at us, its face was almost human, but not quite. The features were just slightly off, like someone had tried to make a human face from memory and gotten the proportions wrong. "Help us," it called out in a perfect child's voice. "We're lost. Please help us." But its mouth didn't move right when it spoke. The voice was coming from somewhere else. Emma yanked the kids closer together. "Don't listen to it," she hissed. "That's not a real kid." More of them appeared. 5, maybe 6 of these gray things moving through the underbrush around us. They kept calling out in children's voices. "Mommy, where are you? I'm scared. Help me, please." But they were clearly trying to lure us away from the trail. The big creature, our protector, I realized, roared again and charged toward the nearest gray thing. What happened next was like something out of a nightmare. The smaller creatures were fast and smart, working together to try to get around the big one. They wanted the kids. That much was obvious. One of them almost succeeded. While the protector was fighting off 2 others, a third gray creature came sprinting up the trail toward us. It was making a beeline for Lily, the smallest girl in our group. I don't know where I found the courage, but I grabbed a fallen branch and swung it as hard as I could. The thing dodged and hissed at me, showing teeth that were too sharp and too many. That's when the protector intervened. It grabbed the gray creature by the back of the neck and flung it into the trees like it weighed nothing. The other gray things scattered, disappearing back into the forest with those horrible howling calls. The big creature turned toward us then, and I thought for sure we were next. But instead of attacking, it made soft, rumbling sounds, almost like it was trying to communicate. It pointed down the trail with one massive arm, then back toward the gray thing's hiding spots. The message was clear. Keep moving, get to safety. We didn't need to be told twice. The rest of the hike passed in a blur of fear and adrenaline. The protector escorted us for maybe another quarter mile, keeping watch in the trees alongside the trail. Then, as suddenly as everything had started, it stopped. The oppressive silence lifted. Birds started singing again. The crushing weight of wrongness that had been pressing down on us all afternoon just vanished. I checked my phone. 12:48 p.m. 1 minute had passed since we'd left the summit. Other hikers started appearing on the trail again. The same families we'd seen that morning, walking and talking like nothing had happened. When we reached the parking lot, there was Mrs. Patterson waiting by the van, checking her watch. "Right on time," she said cheerfully. "How was the hike?" Emma and I looked at each other. How could we possibly explain what had just happened? Who would believe us? "Fine," I managed to say. Everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. Neither Emma nor I slept well for weeks afterward. We both quit our counselor jobs at the end of that summer and never went back to Blood Mountain. Emma ended up studying animal behavior in college, she say. I that day convinced her there were things in the world that science hadn't discovered yet. She wanted to understand them. I became a teacher because I realized how precious and vulnerable kids really are. Every day when I see my students, I think about how easily things can go wrong, how quickly the normal world can become something else entirely. I still don't know what those gray things were or what the protector creature was. I've done research over the years, looked up local legends and folklore, but never found anything that quite matches what we saw. Sometimes I wonder if they're still up there, locked in their eternal conflict over territory and prey. What I do know is this: if you ever find yourself on Blood Mountain and all the other hikers suddenly disappear, don't stick around to find out why. Get those kids and get out of there as fast as you can. And if you hear children's voices calling for help from the forest, remember that sometimes the things that sound most human are the furthest thing from it. I never told Mrs. Patterson what really happened that day, but sometimes I catch her looking at me with this knowing expression, like maybe she sent us up there for a reason. Like maybe she knew what we'd find. To this day, I won't take field trips to any mountainous areas. The other teachers think I'm being overprotective, but they weren't there. They didn't see what's really living in those ancient forests, or witness the kind of war that's been going on up there probably since before humans ever set foot in Appalachia. Some mountains have guardians, and some have things that guardians exist to protect us from. I'm 67 years old, and I've been organizing my family's reunion for the past 20 years. My name's Bobby Wilson, and honestly, I never thought I'd be the type to keep family traditions alive. But when my grandfather passed and left me the old cabin up in Deadwood Hollow, it just seemed like the right thing to do. Every 10 years since I was 27, the Wilson family has gathered at that same mountain cabin in eastern Kentucky. This year was supposed to be our 5th reunion, and I'd invited 23 family members, including some of the grandkids who'd never been up there before. I was planning to make it our last one, though nobody knew that yet. Something about that place has never sat right with me, and after 40 years of going back, I finally understand why. The cabin sits about 15 miles up a winding dirt road from the nearest town, tucked into a hollow that's so deep the sun barely reaches the bottom until noon. My great-grandfather built it back in the 1920s as a hunting lodge, and it's been in our family ever since. The thing is solid as a rock. Thick log walls, stone foundation, wood-burning stove that could heat the whole place even in January. Growing up, I loved going there with my dad and uncle for weekend fishing trips. It felt like stepping back in time, away from everything modern and complicated. But there was always something off about the place at night. Even as a kid, I noticed how quiet it got once the sun went down. Not the normal quiet you'd expect in the mountains. I'm talking about a silence so complete it felt like the whole world had just stopped breathing. No owls, no crickets, no rustling leaves. Just this heavy, pressing quiet that made you want to whisper even inside the cabin. My dad always said it was because we were so far from civilization, but I'd been camping in plenty of remote places, and none of them felt like Deadwood Hollow after, or dark. The first time I heard the voice, I was 27 and had just brought my new wife Sarah up for our honeymoon. We'd decided to spend a week at the cabin instead of going somewhere expensive, and honestly, it seemed romantic at the time. The place was beautiful during the day, with a clear creek running right behind the cabin and hiking trails that led up to some incredible views. But on our third night there, Something woke me up at exactly 3:33 in the morning. I know the time because I checked my watch, an old habit from my Army days. At first I thought it was Sarah calling my name from outside. Her voice was coming from somewhere near the tree line, maybe 50 yards from the cabin. She was saying "Bobby" in this sing-song way, like she was playing hide and seek. The thing is, when I rolled over, Sarah was right there next to me, fast asleep. I shook her gently and asked if she'd been outside, but she just mumbled something about being tired and rolled back over. I listened for another few minutes, but the voice had stopped, and eventually I convinced myself I'd been dreaming. That was 1983, and I didn't think much about it until our first official family reunion in 1993. By then, Sarah and I had our daughter Emma, who was 5 at the time. We'd brought my parents, my Uncle Ray, and a few cousins for a long weekend of fishing and catching up. Everything was going great until the second night when Emma came running into our bedroom around 3 in the morning, crying and saying that Mommy was calling her from the woods. Sarah was right there next to me again, sound asleep, but Emma insisted she'd heard her mother's voice telling her to come outside and play. I carried Emma back to her bed and stayed with her until she fell asleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from outside. The next morning I found tiny footprints in the dirt, or the tree line. Definitely a child's prints, leading from the cabin toward the woods. When I asked Emma about it, she said she'd tried to follow Mommy's voice, but got scared when she realized it was dark outside. If I hadn't caught her coming back into the cabin, she might have kept walking right into those trees. 10 years later, in 2003, it was my father's turn. He was 71 then, still sharp as a tack, but he'd been having some health problems. On the last night of that reunion, I woke up to find his bed empty. I searched the cabin and finally found him about a quarter mile into the woods, standing perfectly still next to a big oak tree. He was staring up at the branches like he was listening to something, but when I called his name, he seemed confused about how he'd gotten there. He said he'd heard his own father, my grandfather who'd been dead for 15 years, calling him from outside. Said Grandpa's voice was clear as day, telling him to come outside because there was something important he needed to show him. Dad was never quite the same after that night. He started having memory problems, and within 2 years we had to move him into assisted living. But before his mind went completely, he told me something that still gives me chills. He said that when he was standing in those woods, he could hear voices coming from underground. Lots of voices, all calling his name at the same time. He said it sounded like our whole family was buried right there beneath his feet, trying to get his attention. The 2013 reunion was when I started to realize this wasn't just coincidence. My nephew Jake, who was 16 and had never been to the cabin before, went missing for 3 hours on the second night. We found him just before dawn, sitting by the creek about a mile downstream, completely soaked and shivering. He said he'd heard his girlfriend calling his name from outside, which was impossible since she lived back in Ohio and had never even seen the cabin. Jake swore the voice led him deeper and deeper into the woods, always staying just out of sight until he finally snapped out of it and realized he was lost. He'd fallen into the creek trying to find his way back and had been following the water downstream ever since. That's when I started asking questions. I called some of the older family members, people who'd been coming to the cabin since they were kids, and every single one of them had a story about hearing voices in the woods. My cousin Beth remembered hearing her dead grandmother calling her name in 1987. Uncle Ray admitted he'd heard his deceased wife's voice during a hunting trip in 1995. Even my own mother, who'd passed away 5 years earlier, had apparently told my aunt that she'd heard voices calling her name every time she stayed at the cabin. The pattern was always the same. Exactly 3:33 a.m., always a familiar voice calling from the woods, and always someone who shouldn't be there, either dead relatives or people who were actually asleep inside the cabin. Whatever was out there had been studying our family for decades, learning our voices, our relationships, our connections to each other, and it was getting better at it. By 2023, I'd decided this year's reunion would be our last, but I couldn't bring myself to tell the family why. How do you explain to 23 people that you think your family cabin is haunted by something that's been hunting your relatives for 40 years? Instead, I told everyone I was thinking about selling the place and retiring somewhere warmer. Most of them seemed disappointed but understanding. After all, I'd been carrying the burden of organizing these things for 2 decades. But I should have canceled the whole thing, because this time, whatever's in those woods didn't just know our names. It knew everything about us. The trouble started on our first night. I was sleeping in the main bedroom with my wife Janet. I'd remarried after Sarah passed in 2018, when I heard the voice calling my 6-year-old granddaughter Emma's name. Not my daughter Emma, who's now in her 30s, but my son's little girl who shares the same name, and the voice was coming from right outside the window, maybe 10 feet away, and it sounded exactly like Emma's mother calling her for breakfast. I got up and checked on little Emma, and thank God she was still asleep in the kids' room with her cousins. But when I looked out the window, I could see a shape standing at the edge of the woods. It was tall and thin, definitely not human, but it was making my daughter-in-law's voice perfectly. Every inflection, every tone. If I'd heard that voice on the phone, I would have sworn it was Rebecca calling. The next morning, I decided to search the cabin more thoroughly than I ever had before. In the basement, behind a loose stone in the foundation, I found my grandfather's journal wrapped in oilcloth. The entries went back to 1923, and what I read there made my blood run cold. According to the journal, my great-grandfather hadn't just stumbled across this land. He'd bought it specifically because the previous owner was desperate to sell. There had been a Cherokee settlement in this hollow for generations before white settlers arrived, and it was considered sacred ground. When the Cherokee were forced out in the 1830s, the tribal elder placed what the journal called a debt of blood on the land. Any family that tried to settle here would owe the spirits one life every generation, to be paid during the time when the veil between worlds was thinnest. My great-grandfather thought it was superstition, but he'd noticed that families didn't tend to stay in Deadwood Hollow very long. After a few years, someone would always die in an accident or disappear, and the survivors would pack up and leave. But he figured out that if you didn't live on the land year-round, if you only brought the family for short visits, you could delay the payment. The spirits would wait, studying the family, learning their voices and their bonds, until they were ready to make their choice. The journal included a list of family members who'd attended reunions over the years, with notes about who had answered the call. Uncle Pete, who supposedly died in a car accident driving home from the 1973 reunion, except his car was found at the bottom of the hollow and his body was never recovered. Cousin Linda, who everyone thought moved to California after the 1985 reunion, but who never answered letters or phone calls again. 3 more relatives over the years, all people who'd supposedly left the cabin alive but who'd really never left at all. I spent the rest of that day digging around the foundation of the cabin, and what I found nearly made me sick. Bones. Human bones, buried in neat rows like a cemetery, but with no markers or headstones. At least 8 sets of remains, maybe more, all family members who'd answered the call over the past 100 years. That night, I told my family everything. I showed them the journal, told them about the voices, explained why so many of our relatives had disappeared over the years. Most of them thought I'd lost my mind, but then 3:33 a.m. rolled around, and the voices started calling. Not just one voice this time, dozens of them. Every family member who'd ever died, all calling their living relatives by name. I heard my father's voice calling my name, my mother calling to my sister, my first wife Sarah calling to our daughter Emma. But the worst part was hearing little Emma's mother calling to her, the same voice I'd heard the night before, sweet and patient and absolutely convincing. Little Emma got up and started walking toward the door like she was sleepwalking. 3 other kids did the same thing, all moving toward the voices calling their names. We had to physically restrain them, and that's when the temperature in the cabin dropped about 20 degrees in the span of a few seconds. The windows started fogging up from the inside, and we could hear footsteps circling the cabin. Dozens of footsteps, like a whole crowd of people were walking around and around the building. That's when I realized what I had to do. This thing, whatever it was, had been patient for 40 years, but it wasn't going to wait much longer. It wanted a Wilson, and if I didn't give it one voluntarily, it was going to take one anyway. And looking at those kids, seeing how easily they'd responded to the voices, I knew it would probably choose one of them. So I made my choice. I told my family to pack up and leave as soon as the sun came up, and to never come back to Deadwood Hollow. Then I walked outside, alone, and into the woods. The spirit was waiting for me about 50 yards into the trees. It looked like a Cherokee warrior, tall and proud, with long black hair and traditional clothing. But its eyes were completely black, and when it spoke, its voice echoed like it was coming from underground. It told me that my family had lived on stolen land for 100 years, that the debt had grown with each generation, and that payment was long overdue. I offered to stay in place of my family, to end the Wilson debt once and for all, and after a long moment, it agreed. But instead of killing me, it changed me. I could feel something moving through my bones, something ancient and patient and hungry. My vision went dark for a moment, and when it cleared, I could see the world differently. I could see the spirits of the Cherokee who'd died defending this land, and I could see the bones of my family members buried under the cabin. I could hear the voices of everyone who'd ever answered the call, and I understood that I was joining them. When my family found me the next morning, I was still alive, but I wasn't the same Bobby Wilson who'd walked into those woods. My eyes had gone completely black, just like the spirits, and my voice carried that same underground echo. I told them to leave and never come back, that the debt was paid, but the land would never be safe for Wilso. Ends again. They packed up and left within an hour. The cabin sold a month later to a developer who plans to tear it down and build vacation homes. I never told them that the developer won't succeed, that some land can't be developed, can't be tamed, can't be made safe for families with children and dreams and futures. These days, I stay in the woods around Deadwood Hollow, and I keep other families away. When hikers get too close to the old Cherokee burial ground, I warn them off. When teenagers come looking for a place to party, I make sure they find somewhere else. The voices still call at 3:33 a.m., but now I'm one of them, and I call back, letting the spirits know that the debt is paid and the land is protected. I still love my family, and I still miss the man I used to be. But some debts run deeper than blood, and some mistakes take generations to fix. My family is safe now, scattered across the country, building new traditions in safer places, and I'm where I need to be, keeping watch over a hollow that holds more bones than memories, more spirits than trees. I don't regret my choice. Looking back, it was the only choice that made sense. Because in the end, family means protecting the ones you love, even if it means becoming something else entirely. I'm 39 years old, and 6 months ago my whole world fell apart when my wife filed for divorce. The papers came on a Tuesday morning while I was drinking coffee and reading work emails. And honestly, I should have seen it coming. We'd been fighting for months about everything: money, my job, the way I never seemed to be around enough. But when she said I could only see Tyler every other weekend, that's when it really hit me. My 15-year-old son, who used to think I hung the moon, now looked at me like I was the reason his family was broken. That's why I planned the camping trip to Copper Ridge. Tyler hadn't wanted to come, of course. He'd sat in my truck for the entire 3-hour drive up into the mountains with his earbuds in, staring out the window like I wasn't even there. Every time I tried to make conversation, I got maybe a grunt or a, "Yeah, whatever, Dad." By the time we reached the little lake where I'd planned to set up camp, I was starting to wonder if this whole thing was a mistake. The campsite was pretty basic, just a clearing about 50 yards from the water with a fire ring someone had built years ago. Tyler didn't help me set up the tent, just sat on a fallen log playing games on his phone while I struggled with the stakes and guy lines. When I asked him to grab the sleeping bags from the truck, he acted like I'd asked him to climb Mount Everest. The kid was angry, and he wanted me to know it. That first evening was rough. I cooked hot dogs over the fire while Tyler sat there scrolling through whatever social media still had service up there. I tried asking about school, about his friends, about the guitar lessons his mom had mentioned. One-word answers every time. Fine. Whatever, I guess. By the time we crawled into the tent around 10 o'clock, I was feeling pretty defeated. I lay there in my sleeping bag listening to him text someone, probably his mom, probably telling her how much he hated being there with me. I don't think I slept much that night. You know how it is when your brain won't shut off. I kept thinking about how I'd lost my son, how maybe Sarah was right and I really wasn't cut out to be a father. The divorce was one thing, but losing Tyler? That felt like losing everything that mattered. But morning brought something I wasn't expecting. Tyler's phone battery had died overnight and he'd forgotten to bring his charger. For the first time in months, maybe years, he actually had to look up from a screen and notice the world around him. The lake was glass smooth that morning, reflecting the pine trees and the mountains like a perfect mirror. I was sitting by the fire making coffee when Tyler shuffled out of the tent, and for just a second, I saw him actually look around and take it in. "We could try fishing," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "I brought some gear." He shrugged, but he didn't say no. That was progress. We spent the morning on the shore casting lines into the deep water near the far bank. Tyler was rusty. It had been years since we'd done anything like this together. But it came back to him pretty quick. When he caught his first bass, a nice one, maybe 2 pounds, he actually smiled, really smiled, for the first time since I'd picked him up Friday afternoon. "Remember when we used to come to that pond behind Grandpa's house?" I asked him as we cleaned the fish later. "You must have been 8 or 9. You caught that huge catfish and insisted we had to throw it back because it was too pretty to eat." Tyler laughed. Actually laughed. "I remember that thing was slimy as hell. Your mom was so mad we came home empty-handed after being gone all day." His face kind of clouded over at the mention of Sarah, but he didn't shut down completely like he usually did. We kept talking. Little bits and pieces, while we cooked the fish for lunch. He told me about some girl at school he liked but was too nervous to talk to. I told him about being 15 and thinking the world was ending every time something didn't go my way. By afternoon, we were actually having something that felt like a real conversation. "Dad," he said while we were sitting by the water later, "I don't really blame you for everything. I mean, I know Mom was angry a lot too." That hit me harder than I expected. This kid, my kid, trying to make sense of an adult mess that wasn't his fault. He actually started crying a little, and for the first time in months, he let me put my arm around him without pulling away. "I miss when we were all together," he said. "I know it's not going to happen, but I miss it." "I miss it too, buddy. I miss it too." We ended up talking until the sun started going down, really talking in a way we hadn't since he was little. Tyler even suggested we stay an extra day, said he wanted to try fishing some of the spots farther around the lake. I called Sarah to let her know we'd be back Monday instead of Sunday, and for once, she didn't argue about it. That's when things started getting weird. We were setting up for our second night when Tyler dropped his fishing rod. He'd been carrying it from the truck to where we'd left our tackle box, and I saw him just lose his grip on it. But instead of falling to the ground like it should have, the damn thing fell up. I'm not kidding. It dropped from his hands and floated up into the branches of a pine tree about 10 feet above us. Tyler stared at it. I stared at it. We both looked at each other like, "Did that just happen?" "Weird," Tyler said. But he was grinning like maybe I was playing some kind of trick on him. I reached up and managed to shake the rod loose from the branches. It fell down normally that time, which made us both feel better. I figured maybe there'd been some freak wind or something, even though the air was perfectly still. But then my coffee cup did the same thing. I'd set it down on the picnic table while I was organizing our gear, and when I reached for it, the cup just lifted off the table and drifted upward like it was filled with helium instead of coffee. Tyler caught it before it got too high, and when he handed it back to me, the coffee inside was still warm and perfectly normal. "Okay, that's definitely not wind," he said. More stuff started happening. Small things at first. A spoon floating off the table, Tyler's baseball cap drifting up from where he'd set it on a log, then bigger stuff. The cooler shifted and tilted upward on one end before settling back down with a thud. A whole pile of firewood I'd stacked near the fire ring just kind of lifted and scattered in different directions, some pieces floating up toward the trees, others drifting sideways like they were underwater. Tyler thought it was cool. He kept trying to catch things as they floated around, laughing and reaching for whatever was drifting by. But I was starting to feel sick to my stomach. This wasn't normal. This wasn't anything I could explain. Then the lake started doing it too. We were standing at the shoreline watching a fishing bobber drift through the air about head high when I noticed the water wasn't right. Near the far shore, it was flowing upward like a slow-motion waterfall running in reverse. Fish were swimming through the air above the surface, their gills working like they were still underwater. A whole school of bluegill just drifted past us at eye level, completely unbothered by the fact that they should have been suffocating. That's when I felt my own body getting lighter. It started as a weird, floating feeling in my stomach, like being on a roller coaster. Then my feet weren't quite making solid contact with the ground anymore. Tyler was having the same problem. He kept taking these weird, bouncing steps like he was walking on a trampoline. "Dad, this is crazy," he said, but he was still grinning. Kids, you know. Everything's an adventure when you're 15. I grabbed onto the nearest tree and pulled Tyler over to me. "Hold on to something, son." We hung there watching our entire campsite slowly lift and rearrange itself in the air around us. The tent drifted up and got tangled in some low branches. Our sleeping bags unrolled themselves in midair. The truck, my 2-ton Chevy pickup, shifted and bobbed like it was floating on invisible water. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything crashed down at once. The truck slammed back onto the ground with a sound like thunder. Our gear scattered everywhere. I hit the dirt hard enough to knock the wind out of me, and Tyler landed in a heap next to the fire ring. For maybe 30 seconds, everything was completely quiet, except for the ringing in my ears. "What the hell was that?" Tyler said, and I didn't even correct his language. I was helping him to his feet when I saw the thing buried in the ground where our picnic table used to be. It looked like a piece of metal, maybe the size of a dinner plate, but it was warm to the touch and humming slightly. There were symbols carved into the surface, patterns I didn't recognize from any language I'd ever seen. Tyler reached out and touched one of the symbols before I could stop him. The air above the device shimmered, and suddenly, we were looking at something impossible. It was like a movie projected in 3 dimensions, but you could walk around it and see it from all angles. The images showed the lake area, but not like it looked now. This was thousands of years ago, when the landscape was completely different. The mountains were smaller, the lake was bigger, and there were structures that definitely hadn't been built by humans. And there were people in the images, except they weren't people, not really. They were tall, maybe 7 feet, and thin in a way that looked wrong, like their proportions had been stretched. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and they moved in this fluid way that didn't quite match how gravity should work. "Dad, are you seeing this?" Tyler whispered. I was seeing it, but I didn't want to believe it. The beings in the images were building things, structures that defied physics, just like what we'd experienced. They were manipulating gravity, making water flow upward, moving massive stones through the air like they weighed nothing. Tyler figured out he could control the images by touching different symbols. The scenes changed, showing us more of their technology, their society. They lived in buildings that seemed to be carved out of solid rock, but the buildings themselves were floating, connected by bridges that spanned impossible distances without any visible support. Then one of the beings in the image turned and looked directly at us. Not at the device, not at the area where the device was, at us specifically. It raised one elongated hand and waved, like it was greeting an old friend. Tyler waved back. That's when the storm hit. I've lived in the mountains my whole life, and I've never seen weather come in that fast. One second we were standing in calm air, looking at impossible holograms, and the next second the sky was black and lightning was hitting the trees around us like artillery fire. The rain came down so hard I couldn't see 5 feet in any direction. The metal device started sparking and smoking, and the images flickered and disappeared. I grabbed Tyler's arm and started pulling him toward the truck. "We need to go, now!" Behind us, through the rain and lightning, I could see them, the tall, pale figures from the images, standing calmly near the shoreline like the storm wasn't even touching them. They were watching us leave, and I swear I could feel their eyes following us as we ran. I've never packed camping gear that fast in my life. We threw everything we could grab into the truck bed and took off, down the mountain road with lightning still crashing all around us. In the rearview mirror, I could see a strange glow coming from the direction of the lake, but Tyler was already asking me to turn around and go back. "Dad, we have to go back. Did you see what they were showing us? We have to go back and learn more." But I kept driving. The storm cleared up the moment we hit the main highway, like someone had thrown a switch. The sun came out, the road was completely dry, and when I looked in the rearview mirror, there wasn't a cloud in the sky behind us. Tyler begged me to turn around for the next 50 miles. He kept saying it was the most amazing thing he'd ever seen, that we had to tell someone, that we had to go back and make contact. But I knew we couldn't. Whatever was up there at Copper Ridge, it was old and powerful and completely beyond anything we could understand. Some things are better left alone. That was 3 months ago. Tyler still asks me about it sometimes, still wants to go back. But our relationship changed that weekend in a way I never expected. We share something now that nobody else would believe, something that bonds us together even though we can't talk about it with anyone else. His anger about the divorce has mostly faded, and he actually looks forward to our weekends together now. I've never told Sarah what happened up there. How could I? She'd think I'd lost my mind. But Tyler and I know what we saw, and that's enough. Sometimes secrets bring people closer together instead of driving them apart. I still drive past the turnoff to Copper Ridge every time I go into the mountains, and I always slow down a little. Part of me wants to go back and see if the device is still there, if those beings are still waiting. But a bigger part of me knows that some doors shouldn't be opened twice. Tyler's 16 now, and sometimes I catch him looking at maps of the area around Copper Ridge. I know he's planning to go back someday, probably when he's old enough to drive himself. I hope when that day comes, he'll be smart enough to just keep driving past that turnoff. But knowing my son, I doubt it. He's got too much curiosity for his own good, just like his old man. And honestly, I'm not sure I blame him. I'm 32 years old, and I still can't wear a watch. Sounds weird, I know, but after what happened to my daughter Sophia and me 3 years ago, I just can't stand having something on my wrist that tells time. Time isn't as reliable as people think it is, especially in certain places, especially in Pine Hollow. I was a single mom back then. Sophia's dad had died in a car accident about 6 months before this trip, and honestly, we were both falling apart. Sophia was 8 and had barely spoken since the funeral. She'd wake up screaming from nightmares, and during the day she'd just sit there staring at nothing. The grief counselor said maybe a change of scenery would help, somewhere peaceful where we could both start healing. I found this little cabin rental online, Pine Hollow, up in the mountains of West Virginia. The photos showed this perfect little valley with hiking trails and a creek running right past the door. It looked like exactly what we needed. The first day was actually wonderful. Sophia showed interest in something for the first time in months. We collected different colored leaves, skipped stones in the creek, and she even laughed when this chipmunk kept stealing crackers from our picnic. I remember thinking maybe the counselor was right. Maybe this was exactly what we needed. That first night, we both slept better than we had since the accident. I woke up feeling hopeful for the first time in months. But the second day, that's when things started getting strange. It began with our watches. I noticed mine was running fast, like really fast. By the time we finished breakfast, it was showing 2:30 in the afternoon, but the sun was barely up over the trees. Sophia's little pink watch, the one her dad had given her for her birthday, was running backward. I thought maybe the altitude was affecting them or something, but that doesn't even make sense when you think about it. The sun wasn't moving right either. We ate lunch at what should have been noon according to my racing watch, but the sky looked like early morning. The shadows were all wrong, pointing directions that didn't match where the sun was sitting. I tried calling the rental office to ask if there were any magnetic fields or weird geology in the area that might mess with electronics. The woman who answered said it was midnight and asked why I was calling so late. My phone showed 12:47 p.m. That's when I started getting really worried. I tried calling my sister back home to check if our phones were just malfunctioning. It went to her answering machine, but the message was from 3 days ago, 3 days before we'd even left for the trip. Sophia found newspapers blowing around near the cabin that were dated next week. I'm talking about the local paper, with weather forecasts and TV schedules for days that hadn't happened yet. I'm not stupid. I knew something was seriously wrong. I packed our stuff and told Sophia we were leaving. But every road out of the valley just led back to the cabin. I'd drive for what felt like hours, taking turns I knew would take us to the main highway, and we'd end up right back at that same wooden sign, Pine Hollow, population 0. After the 4th time, I stopped trying. That night, we heard something in the woods. It sounded like a child crying, but not quite human. The pitch was wrong, and it went on too long without stopping to breathe. Sophia said it reminded her of the sounds her daddy made right after the accident, before the ambulance came. I hadn't told her about those sounds. She shouldn't have remembered them. The next morning, I found it. I was gathering firewood when I heard that crying again, closer this time. I followed the sound deeper into the trees, and there it was, this thing that looked almost like a child, Mom. Might be 5 or 6 years old, but wrong in ways I can't properly describe. Its proportions were off, limbs too long, head tilted at an angle that would break a human neck. Its skin was pale and translucent, like you could see shadows moving underneath. But its eyes, God, its eyes were so sad and desperate. It was hurt somehow, I could tell that much. It kept making these sounds of pain and grief, but when I got closer, I realized it was mimicking sounds. The crying wasn't its natural voice. It was copying the sound of human suffering because that's what it understood. That's what it fed on. I should have been terrified, but instead I felt this overwhelming wave of recognition. This thing was grieving too. It had been alone in this valley for who knows how long, starving. And when Sophia and I showed up with our fresh pain and loss, it finally had something to sustain it. The time distortion, trapping us here. It wasn't malicious. It was desperate. I went back and got Sophia. I know that sounds crazy, bringing an 8-year-old to see some kind of forest creature, but she wasn't afraid. She looked at it and said, "It's sad like us, isn't it, Mommy?" We started visiting it every day. Sophia would tell it about her daddy, about the accident, about her nightmares. I talked about how scared I was raising her alone, how angry I was at the world for taking her father away from us, and somehow the creature communicated back. Not with words, but I could feel its story, how it had lost its own family long, long ago, how it had been alone in this valley for decades, maybe centuries. The strangest thing was how much better we all felt. Sophia started talking more in those few days than she had in the previous 6 months. My own grief, which had felt like this crushing weight on my chest, started to feel manageable. Sharing our pain with something that understood loss on such a deep level, it was healing for all of us. On the 5th day, the creature explained that it had to leave. I don't know how I understood this, but I did. It migrated south, H for the winter, and it was already late in the season. The time distortion had been its attempt to make our visit last longer, but it was strong enough now to continue its journey. It had what it needed to survive. Sophia hugged it goodbye. This ancient, otherworldly thing, and my 8-year-old daughter wrapped her arms around it like it was just another friend from school. She promised she'd never forget it, and I know she hasn't. As soon as the creature disappeared into the deeper woods, time snapped back to normal. Our watches started working properly. The sun moved across the sky the way it was supposed to. When I tried the road out of the valley, it led exactly where it should have. We stayed one more night, just to process everything that had happened. Then we drove home, and for the first time since the accident, we both felt ready to rebuild our lives. Sophia kept a journal about her forest friend for months after we got back. She'd draw pictures of it and write little stories about the conversations they had. The grief counselor said it was a healthy way for her to process her father's death, creating an imaginary friend who understood loss. I never corrected her. I still think about that creature sometimes, wondering if it made it through the winter, if it found other grieving souls to sustain it. I hope it did. And sometimes, when Sophia and I are having a hard day missing her dad, I can almost feel that sense of shared understanding we had in Pine Hollow, like maybe healing isn't something you do alone. But I still can't wear a watch. Time feels too fragile now, too easily bent and broken. and maybe that's not such a bad thing to remember. I'm 28 now, and I work in marketing for a tech company in Charlotte. 3 years ago, my boss decided our department needed some team bonding, so she signed me, Mike, and Sarah up for this corporate retreat thing at Black Rock Lodge up in the North Carolina mountains. None of us were thrilled about it. We barely knew each other since we worked in different departments, and honestly, we all thought it was a waste of a perfectly good weekend. The lodge was one of those rustic places with wooden beams and stone fireplaces that companies love for their wilderness experience packages. Our itinerary was packed with hiking, rock climbing, and trust exercises. The whole 9 yards of corporate team-building nonsense. The first day was exactly as painful as we'd expected. We did rope courses and played icebreaker games where we had to share fun facts about ourselves. By evening, we were all pretty annoyed and ended up bonding over complaining about how stupid the whole thing was. That night at the lodge bar, after a few drinks, we actually started having real conversations. Mike worked in IT and was dealing with a messy divorce. Sarah was in accounting and had just moved here from Seattle. We found out we all had way more in common than we thought, and for the first time all day, we were actually enjoying ourselves. Around midnight, Sarah suggested we skip the official activities the next day and go explore on our own. Mike and I were immediately on board, anything to avoid more trust falls and team-building exercises. The next morning, while the other groups were doing their scheduled hikes with guides, the 3 of us grabbed some trail mix and water bottles and headed out on our own. We found a trail that looked promising and started hiking deeper into the mountains. For the first hour or so, everything was normal. We were laughing, taking pictures, and actually having a good time for once. That's when things started getting weird. It began with our phones acting up. Mine kept trying to connect to networks that didn't exist, showing signal bars 1 minute and no service the next. Mike's watch stopped working completely, the digital display just showing random numbers. Sarah's phone started playing music backward, like the songs were literally playing in reverse. We thought it was funny at first, some kind of glitch. Then we noticed the compasses on our phones were spinning wildly. The GPS showed we were in places that didn't make sense. Sometimes it said we were in Virginia, sometimes Tennessee, even though we hadn't crossed any state lines. My keys, which were on a metal carabiner clipped to my backpack, started sticking to the rocks we passed. Not just any rocks, specific ones that looked completely normal, but grabbed metal objects like magnets. Mike tried to blow his emergency whistle when we realized we couldn't figure out which direction we'd come from, but instead of making a sound, it seemed to attract metal objects. Sarah's water bottle, which had a steel cap, flew right out of her hand and stuck to a tree about 10 feet away. We had to pry it off. That's when I started to realize we were dealing with some kind of massive magnetic anomaly. I'd heard about places like this existing, but I'd never experienced anything like it. Our electronic devices were either completely malfunctioning or working in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Sarah's tablet, which had been dead when we started hiking, suddenly turned on and showed a full battery. We tried to retrace our steps, but every path seemed to lead us deeper into the mountains instead of back toward the lodge. It was like the magnetic field was pulling us in a specific direction, and fighting against it was exhausting. After about 2 hours of walking in circles, he decided to follow where the magnetic pull seemed strongest, hoping it would lead us to some kind of explanation. That's how we found the mine entrance. It was hidden behind some overgrown brush, but the metal detector app on Mike's phone, which had randomly started working perfectly, was going crazy in that direction. The entrance looked old, maybe decades, but the wooden supports were in perfect condition, like they'd been preserved somehow. Inside, we found mining equipment that looked like it was from the 1800s, but it wasn't rusted or deteriorated at all. There were carts filled with ore that had this faint, pulsing glow. Mike found logbooks dating back 150 years with entries that didn't make any sense. The miners wrote about singing stones and metal that thinks. At first, we thought they were just describing the sounds the equipment made, but then Sarah noticed something incredible. The ore in the carts was responding to our emotions. When she laughed at something Mike said, the glow got brighter. When I got nervous about how deep we were going, it dimmed. It was like the mineral was somehow connected to our mental states. That's when things got really strange. My phone started displaying text messages that none of us had sent. "Welcome, surface dwellers." Mike's broken watch began showing coordinates that led to deeper levels of the mine. Sarah's tablet played videos that showed the mining operation from over a century ago, but in perfect high-definition quality. The ore wasn't just responding to us. It was communicating with us through our devices. Somehow, this mineral had developed into a collective intelligence that had been waiting for contact. The original miners hadn't just been extracting metal. They'd formed some kind of symbiotic relationship with whatever consciousness existed in the rock. All three of us started experiencing shared thoughts and enhanced abilities. I could sense exactly what Mike and Sarah were feeling without them saying anything. Our minds connected temporarily, creating this group consciousness that included the mineral intelligence. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. That's when we heard the helicopters. Military choppers appeared overhead, and soldiers rappelled directly into the mine shaft. They detained us immediately, claiming we'd accessed a hazardous environmental site without authorization. Later, we learned the government had been monitoring the magnetic anomaly for decades. They separated us for debriefing and made us sign non-disclosure agreements. The official story was that the area contained dangerous mineral deposits that could cause hallucinations and equipment malfunctions. They offered all three of us jobs studying the phenomenon officially. I accepted a position with a geological survey team. Mike and Sarah went back to their corporate jobs, but we stayed in contact. The weird thing is, we maintained that mental connection even after leaving the mine. We meet once a month to discuss it, and sometimes we can still sense each other's emotions from miles away. I've spent the last 3 years studying similar magnetic anomalies across Appalachia, and I've found evidence of at least 12 other locations with comparable properties. I still work for the survey team, but I've never found anything quite like what we experienced at Black Rock. The lodge doesn't offer retreats anymore. The government bought the property and restricted access to the entire area. Sometimes I wonder if we were the last people to make contact with that intelligence, or if there are others out there having similar experiences. Looking back, I'm grateful my boss forced us to go on that retreat. It changed all our lives permanently, just not in the way the company intended. Mike and Sarah are still my closest friends, bound together by something most people would never believe. We joke that we got the ultimate team-building experience, but honestly, some connections run deeper than any corporate exercise could ever create. I'm 47 years old now, and I work as a trauma counselor in Phoenix. People think it's strange that someone who grew up in the Appalachian Mountains ended up in the desert, but honestly, I can't stand being around trees anymore. Mountains make my skin crawl. My husband Tom and I were supposed to have our honeymoon in those West Virginia hills 3 years ago. I say we're supposed to because Tom never came back from that trip. The police found his torn clothes scattered across a ridge near Raven's Gap, but they never found him. They never found what we discovered up there either, though I told them exactly where to look. The detective who interviewed me said I was in shock, said trauma can make people remember things that didn't happen. But I know what I saw. I know what's still up there, collecting. Tom and I were both in our 40s when we got married. Second marriage for both of us. We'd each been through messy divorces and had pretty much given up on finding someone who understood what it meant to start over. We met at a grief support group, if you can believe that, both dealing with the death of our previous relationships, I guess. Tom was 42, an accountant who loved hiking. I was 45, working as a school counselor, and I'd always found peace in the mountains growing up. We planned a simple honeymoon. Nothing fancy, just 4 days at a rental cabin near Raven's Gap, hiking the trails we'd both loved as kids. The cabin was perfect when we arrived. Secluded, beautiful views of the valley. Everything we'd hoped for after looking at photos online for months. We spent the first day hiking the easier trails, holding hands like teenagers, talking about how lucky we felt to have found each other this late in life. That first evening, Tom suggested we extend the trip by a day. "What's one more day in paradise?" he said, grilling burgers on the cabin's little porch while I opened a bottle of wine. I called my sister to let her know we'd be back a day later than planned. Everything felt perfect, safe. We fell asleep that night holding hands, talking about maybe buying a little place up there for weekends. I woke up the second morning with the worst headache of my life. Blood was trickling from my nose, staining the pillow. Tom was already awake, pressing his palms against his ears. "Jesus, Maria, do you feel that?" he asked. I did. It felt like being in an airplane during takeoff, that pressure that makes your ears pop, except we were on the ground. The cabin had a little barometric pressure gauge on the porch. Tom was obsessed with weather, and when we checked it, the reading was impossible. The needle was buried so far into the red that it had bent. The weather outside was clear, not a cloud in the sky. But something was wrong with the air itself. We both felt sick walking around. I'd get dizzy just standing up, and Tom kept stumbling on flat ground like he was drunk. Small objects in the cabin would float for a few seconds. A coffee mug, my reading glasses, then drop suddenly like something had let go of them. But the worst part was the birds. They weren't dead, but they couldn't fly. We found them on the ground around the cabin, flapping their wings frantically, but unable to get airborne. Tom tried to help a cardinal, picking it up gently, but as soon as he released it, it fell straight down like a stone. "Something's affecting gravity," Tom said. He was always trying to find logical explanations for things. Maybe there's a magnetic anomaly or something. I wanted to leave right then, pack up and go home a day early, but Tom convinced me to explore a little first, see if we could figure out what was happening. "We're scientists," he said, though neither of us were. "Let's at least try to understand it." Behind the cabin, maybe 100 yards into the woods, I found them. Bones. Hundreds of them, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at. Not random piles, but precise geometric designs that stretched between the trees like some kind of architectural blueprint. Animal bones mostly, deer skulls, bird bones, what looked like bear femurs, but all positioned with mathematical precision. The patterns were too complex for a human to have made, too large for any animal. They formed spirals that led deeper into the forest, and following them, we discovered larger structures. Bridges made entirely of bones, towers that defied physics, spiraling up into the canopy, geometric shapes that seemed to shift when you looked at them from different angles. Tom found the human bones mixed in with the rest, skull fragments, rib bones, a complete human spine arranged in a perfect helix around a tree trunk. "Someone's been collecting these for decades," Tom whispered. But it wasn't someone. It was something. Deep in what we started calling the Bone City, we met the builder. It was humanoid, but wrong in every way that mattered. 7 feet tall, thin as a scarecrow, with arms and legs that had too many joints. Its hands could rotate completely around. I watched it turn its wrists 360 degrees while it worked, fitting a deer skull into a complex pattern we couldn't understand. The creature communicated through pressure changes. When it spoke, our ears would pop in specific rhythms, and somehow, impossibly, I began to understand what it was trying to tell us. It was learning, studying every species that had ever lived in these mountains. The bone arrangements weren't art or ritual. They were a kind of blueprint. It was evolving itself, using the skeletons of everything it collected to understand how life worked, how bodies moved, how anatomy could be improved. The pressure changes we'd been feeling, that was how it scanned us. Reading our internal structure, mapping our bones, figuring out how we were put together. Tom realized what was happening before I did. "It's analyzing us," he said, Backens. G away slowly. "We're not visitors. We're specimens." The creature tilted its head at an impossible angle, watching us with eyes that weren't quite in the right place. It had evolved beyond whatever it originally was, crafting itself into something more efficient, more perfect, using knowledge stolen from every skeleton in its collection. I ran when Tom told me to. He stayed behind to distract it, shouting for me to get help. I heard him screaming as I crashed through the woods, but by the time I made it back to the cabin, and then to the nearest ranger station, it was too late. The search teams found Tom's clothes on a ridge a mile from where we'd encountered the creature. Torn fabric caught on branches, his hiking boots placed neatly side by side like he'd stepped out of them. But no bones, no body, nothing. They searched for the bone structures too, after I told them exactly where to look. Found nothing, just normal forest, normal trees, normal ground where I swore I'd seen impossible architecture made from the dead. I moved to Arizona 6 months later. Couldn't stand the mountains anymore, couldn't handle the way the air felt thick in wooded areas. I started working with trauma victims because I understood what it meant to survive something that nobody else would believe. Sometimes, even here in the desert, I feel that pressure change in my ears. Like something far away is trying to scan me, trying to understand how I'm built. When that happens, I know it's still up there in Raven's Gap, still collecting, still learning, still evolving. The police closed Tom's case after a year. Missing person, presumed dead. But I know better. Tom isn't missing. He's part of the collection now, his bones arranged in some pattern I couldn't understand, helping that thing learn how to be more than what it was. I don't hike anymore, don't camp, don't even like walking through city parks when the trees get too thick, because I know that somewhere out there, something is still building itself from the pieces of everything that came before, and it's getting better at being human.